Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and in our last two videos we talked about chaos in War of the Visions and how it creates unpredictable situations, both through the lens of complexity and then through the lens of randomness. Those videos are definitely going to help you understand this video, in which I'm going to talk about how to make our matches more predictable in a number of really practical ways, in ways that hopefully you can use to increase your enjoyment of War of the Visions if things like complexity and randomness are things that are bothering you. I want to take a few lessons here for this video, generally from Magic the Gathering. I mentioned this as being the most complex and random game that is largely popular. Definitely the most complex game. Maybe not the most random, the most complex for sure. And one of the lessons that I think is helpful here is the format that they typically compete in. Now, this doesn't necessarily exist on mobile, as this at least isn't the default and isn't the way that most people play in Magic the Gathering Arena. But a lot of competitive Magic is played in best of 3, and this can help iron out randomness and more make it about proper building and proper preparation. I think we could also do this to minimize the impact of curveball characters, status effects, and, say, counter effects. So this could really reduce the impact of randomness on the outcomes. And I think that while this isn't something that's probably going to be adopted in-app, it is something that we could adopt within a kind of tournament setup. It would take more time, which makes it unideal for a mobile game to implement. But there is a version of this in Magic the Gathering Arena. It is an opt-in, so maybe there is a market for this, and maybe some of the people out there who really hate randomness would enjoy this. I also like the idea of having a little bit of time to sideboard in between matches, where you can change your equipment, change your vision cards, change your espers to better suit you into the matchup. And for this video, I am going to be, where I can, showing you best of 3 so that you can see when randomness is and isn't affecting the outcomes of matches and how. But before I do that, the first example I want to show you is probably my only example of being able to reduce complexity in a beneficial way within War of the Visions. And if you've been watching the channel for a while, this is going to come as no surprise. I'm talking about the Blade Stream combo. So it may be beneficial, as I've noted before, to use some type of a green mage, and I'm going to put some green mages on screen that can do this for you. But these green mages have a passive that allows them to extend the length of the debuffs and buffs that they use by 1 turn. I'm not entirely sure that this affects the AP regeneration part of this skill, and that's really the most important part here. So this may be nothing, but it also may be a helpful way to squeeze out even more advantage from this technique. And while I've talked about how this works in a number of videos, I've never really necessarily talked about why. I mean, I have, but really the why is that this reduces complexity in one of the most fundamental ways that you can, other than just outright stopping your opponents from acting entirely. Removing their AP means that maybe not at first, the beginning of the fight may not change tremendously, but the end of the fight will ultimately, for your opponents, if you have chosen them wisely, result in a state where they just do the most predictable possible thing, and that is only use their basic attacks against you, which also means that they have no ranged options, which can mean that on certain turns they do not act at all other than to move closer to you. There is a major downside to this strategy in that it is itself kind of complex, but thankfully this is in a predictable way. The reason I've been pushing this strategy recently is because it works really well against units that have this inbuilt assumption that they will have AP regeneration baked into their kit. Units like Advent Children Sephiroth, Ashen King Mont, and to a lesser degree Elda King of the Lions all fit this profile. And if you can line up 1 or more of these characters, but preferably 2 of them, on the same team, you're going to have a decided advantage, at least against those units, and you will be able to push them into a game state that provides them less complexity than they would if you had allowed them to have that AP regeneration. That being said, the way that the Blade Stream buff works is kind of maximally bad strategically, as it forces your character to run forward. And since this is a hyper-specific and hyper-powerful debuff, if it doesn't line up with the enemy team, you have wasted your turn in the worst possible way. While this is specific and complex, it's also pretty easy to judge when it's going to be good and when it's going to be bad, so it is relatively predictable. Moving back to our Magic the Gathering example, let's start talking about randomness. There are decks that you would play where, especially in your sideboard, you might want to run protection spells for your creatures or enchantments or whatever you're trying to keep on the field. If you're going up against, say, red, which can just burn them off the field or kill them in some way, I guess black could do this as well, or even blue, which can counter them. Countering happened to be specifically a good metaphor for this because counter effects in War of the Visions are one of two only examples of true randomness within the game, and these can really change the outcomes of fights in certain scenarios. Also, they're more likely to happen because everybody has at least one counter, and some newer units can have 2 or 3 active at a time. I don't think 3, but at least 2. But luckily there are 2 ways of dealing with this, one of which I prefer for its consistency that is a little bit limited in some other ways. There's trade-offs to either of these, but I think one of them is ultimately more predictable, and that's reaction block rate. Reaction block rate can be seen as like a counter penetration, and there are skills that can easily get you to 100% in this, and check your kits and see if you have them. But I'm also going to focus on some ways to add them to your build as well, specifically looking maybe at TMRs or stuff that increase your reaction block rate with a buff. This way most characters can benefit from this, and you can have more flexible compositions that can take into account counter blocking. The reason I like this better than reduce counter chance is that reduce counter chance is a debuff. Therefore, even using 100% reduced counter chance on a character with debuff weakening is not going to completely reduce randomness on the part of that character. However, as a benefit, once applied to that character, this rate now affects all of your character's interaction with them. It's a different way of going about it, but I think that this way of going about it also runs into the same problems as seal on effect, because this is essentially counter sealing on attack. So you run into those familiar problems of, do you line up before they counter you impactfully or not? And thankfully this isn't as big a deal, but this does in a lot of ways, while it has its advantages, have drawbacks that reduce its consistency. Another thing I want to talk about are Malboro teams. So when we talk about curveballs, we're usually talking about units that can, through some random chance, usually status effects, win a fight all by themselves or turn a fight around that they shouldn't be able to win otherwise. Luckily, we have a lot of really powerful curveball units that can win a fight even without their curveball statuses, just by virtue of the fact that they're very powerful characters. The champions of this being Sephiroth from Advent Children and Curse, but also Helena the Black Rose with Sleep, both of these being very powerful effects that can turn around the shape of a fight, while also being attached to characters that can still kick your ass even without them. One thing that you might be doing if you want to utilize characters like this is overlapping your team with various characters that have different status abilities to essentially make your team like a Malboro, one of the most iconic and difficult opponents to face in Final Fantasy titles, because if they survive long enough to use Bad Breath, they inflict such a wide variety of statuses that any amount of preparation, with the exception of ribbon effects, is not going to save you. Also, there is no ribbon in War of the Visions. The closest thing is the last year's April Fool's item, or maybe year before last actually, Bailio's cell phone. And this also has some drawbacks because it also limits your ability to receive haste, quicken, and courage. I think there might be a shell and protect as well. So there are drawbacks to this. It doesn't just get rid of negative things, but also some positive ones. Also, because this is set, it's not like reduce all statuses. I don't think it applies to certain things, and one of them, being the newest, is Curse. So even with this item on your team, you're still not getting necessarily a better matchup versus Sephiroth, which I think makes him really important for this team. But basically the idea here is that maybe they build resistance to sleep, and therefore they've countered the randomness within Helena's kit, but you still have to deal with Curse, and you still have to deal with the third character who might be doing paralysis or might be doing any number of other effects. With Vivi here, you could be talking about stun. Now, while these fights are pretty random, I'm ultimately winning relatively consistently within this best of 3 scenario with a team that is, while using basically the same characters, under-reincarnated, has much poorer equipment, has much poorer vision cards, and just really isn't set up well for this. The advantage that they have in this fight is really the fact that they have gone all in on status. And the fact that they have gone all in on status makes them consistent despite randomness and despite counterplay. And I think that this draws from something in Magic where, you've got 60 cards, but you can only run 4 of the same card. This often leads to deck lists that have 3 or 4 cards sometimes that do exactly the same thing, which means that you have the chance of that effect popping up in your deck now 12 to 16 times, which makes it incredibly likely that you draw it by, say, turn 3 when you've gone 10 cards at least deep into your deck. This works kind of the same way, in that having more characters with more detrimental statuses on your team means that even if your opponent lines up beneficially against them, you're still running enough of them that something's going to work, and that even if the odds aren't in your favor on sleep, maybe you get a couple of stuns. Maybe if the odds aren't in your favor for a couple of stuns, you get to curse their entire team. You have options, you have variety. Status effects and war divisions are another way in which true randomness rears its ugly head, but these are also counterable. Although, since there's a whole lot of statuses, this means that you really have to pick and choose what you build your resistances to. Units can have up to a 50% native resistance, and because statuses are already not 100% effective, this essentially means that in most cases, they're basically immune. You can push this immunity even further by running low faith, which is more practical for physical attackers that don't have status effects, but maximally impractical for mages, but especially mages that themselves have status effects. But the other way involves building your resistances even further, and because mages are especially vulnerable here, they need to be built up even more. There are items that provide full nullification of a variety of status effects, and these come with their drawbacks. I'll talk more about one later. But there are also a variety of TMRs, several of which I will show you, that often have AoE buddy buffs that deal with a variety of different statuses themselves. So if you're going into a matchup against Charm, you could use a combination of these nullification buffs to really take basically any team into a point where you have turned off whether or not Sodley can screw up your entire tempo of the fight. If you get these buddy buffs reliably off on 2 characters, then the third character could use native resistances combined with an additional 25% resistance that can be given for any status through trust runes. If you roll the right ones, they have to start at 8%, they will maximize at 25%. But some combination of these 2 or 3 things should be able to build you up at least a couple of resistances that are important in the matchup that you are seeking to have. This is also kind of a specific and complex strategy, but it really works when you get to pick the offensive scenario.
Now for the final push, my lord!
It's difficult to build against all of these things. Difficult but not impossible. As I've already demonstrated earlier in this video, changing just one variable within a fight can really change the outcome. So what I'm building here is an anti-Malboro team. We're going to be running up against basically the same team that was kicking our butt earlier, except that I'm going to be running this as a team with Folka instead. Now, as I noted in my Folka showcase, she definitely does certain things well, and I'm going to be trying to maximize on those in this fight, and it definitely works out to my favor. And honestly, this is the most consistent team I tested all day, at least in this particular matchup. We're running a little bit of an odd TMR on Sephiroth, by the way. He's using Curative Field to give himself and Helena full sleep resistance. Helena herself is running the Balo smartphone that I just mentioned, so she has natively sleep nullification, and Folka through her status, or through her passive Still Waters, also has sleep nullification. So no matter what happens, and no matter how many times we get rose blasted, no one is going to fall asleep. At least unless the match goes on until the regen effect runs off for Sephiroth, and then he can be put to sleep. But consistently we're closing out the match before that happens. This is the TMR of 9S, and I think it's interesting that we got a rerun of the Nier Automata collaboration while Helena was being a menace, because this is a really interesting anti-Helena TMR. And I mean, there's other things going on this team. We're also using AP denial because this is Folka, and I think that that really plays to her strengths. But at the same time, this is also a team that is winning through strategy and also winning through consistency and also winning despite our opposing team being essentially maximally random and consistently random. So I hope that this whole guide has shown you the variety of ways which randomness can be weaponized and even nullified within the game of War of the Visions. The fact that you can do all this just kind of adds to the complexity of it, but in a fun way this time. This is decidedly a very strategically exciting way to utilize complexity and randomness. And unlike the people who, seem to relate combat these days to being a slot machine and not a strategic game, I think this is because the game has become so complex that you can't see the strategy anymore, and therefore it appears random to you. However, really with enough data and with enough testing, it's not that bad. It's just that it has become complex to a point where it becomes really difficult to form accurate gut assessments of how things are going to go ahead of time. So it's unpredictable, but not. It's just a little bit outside of our bounds of easy human prediction. Another thing to note about the team that I'm using here as an anti-Malboro team is that because Sephiroth is, for one, because of the things that I talked about with Faith earlier and the lack of resistances in a variety of the ways that I described, although not trust runes. I'm actually not using anti-curse trust runes, and I absolutely should be with this team because it is a glaring weakness for them. And it can actually produce cases where I still have a lot of trouble here, but I've been able to nullify enough of the randomness within this match that I can kind of count on curse going off, unfortunately, and build around that. But it's going to be important to utilize this type of at least attempt at curse prevention, especially for physical units, because they already have the low faith, to make them initially a bit more resistant to curse. I would imagine, although I don't know the number specifically, that with a curse trust rune, a physical unit at 50 faith should have around a 1 in 3 chance of being cursed by Sephiroth's LB. Contrast this with a 97 faith mage with no resistances who has basically a 100% chance of being cursed. So this is definitely a weakness in my team that I just haven't taken the time to iron out, but keep in mind that if I did, this would at least give me a 1 in 4 chance for all of my characters to get out of curse in situations where they ordinarily wouldn't, and it should make this whole setup way more effective and consistent. The fact that it still works despite the fact that I'm not doing that really indicates that if you focus on some of the right things, even a large amount of complexity can be reduced to a few key interactions. The problem is it takes a lot of in-depth metagame knowledge sometimes to be able to determine when those key interactions are going to come into play and which interactions are in fact key ones. But with all that being said, there is one more wrinkle to add in here, and you've probably noticed it. For some reason, Vivi's threshold heal, despite other threshold heals not working this way, apparently doesn't count as healing because it consistently goes off despite him being cursed. This is either a glitch or it's the result in it being based on a set percentage of his HP and therefore kind of unchangeable. This means it won't be affected by healing power, and it also apparently means it's not affected by curse. There are other abilities that work this way. One that I can think of is Hustle Mastery from Slime. It would be really interesting to see if his heal still works on cursed characters, because I mean, he's a 120 unit, but it would be really interesting if he has the ability to heal around curse, especially in cost-limited content. That could be pretty fun, and it really gives Vivi an interesting wrinkle here that allows him to do a little bit better in this matchup than maybe he should have or you would have expected him to. This is yet another level of complexity that not all heals are actually heals. Ain't that weird? So with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. Remember, the free-to-play option for YouTube is to like, subscribe, and send me tasty, tasty comments. I may be eating those up and gobbling them out and baby birding them back to you as an audience in a comment response video in the future. But also, while you're down there near the comment section, check out the description. There's a Linktree link that will link you back to my main channel. There's also a podcast version of that channel if you just want to chill and listen in the car. There are ways to send donations to the channel. If you want a one-time donation, send me $10 and a little note that says, "Hey Fox, you got to use these for pulls," or "Hey Fox, don't use these for pulls. Buy yourself and your family some food, you dirty bastard." Or if you feel like this video wasn't enough to earn a donation, even though I think complicating, God damn it, even though I'm diving deep into the, by its nature, most complex topic in War of the Visions and trying to make it understandable for you, even as a layman, well, you could also buy my books. If you think my books are cool, hey, thanks for the money, and I hope you enjoy the book. I write both in fantasy. I have a series that's based on tabletop that I designed and had my friends play through, and then recorded their experiences in the story, added some flavor, and turned it into a series of books. There's also a grittier kind of like near future cyberpunk that's set in the recent past. Kind of gets itself stuck in the grungy COVID era. Very interesting feel because it was a very unique time in history, and I think maybe here in 2024 we've got enough emotional distance from what was a kind of traumatizing experience that maybe we can enjoy fiction set in that unique experience. If that sounds like your kind of thing, check out the book It Even Happens While We Sleep. Links to that and Athena's Chosen are going to be in that link in the description. Athena's Chosen being the first book in the series I said is based on tabletop gameplay. And hey, maybe since you're into Final Fantasy games, that's the kind of thing that trips your trigger. And if it is, check out that book in the description. But with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one. Also, usually don't do a PS on these videos, but I recorded this one entirely on my phone because, especially with like AI voice correction and voice stabilization features being so much more important for telecommunication, phones have actually become, even with bad microphones, really good at recording audio, or at least voice content. So if this worked out for you, let me know. If you notice the difference, also let me know.